Let's take a look here at the 2014 AP Macro question number 1. This can be a longer question. All right, here it is. Assume that the United States economy is currently operating below the full employment level of real gross domestic product with a balanced budget. Okay, so there's a couple things we want to sort of highlight, underline here. Below full employment level, that should jump out at you as another way of saying recessionary gap, right? We're going to be below the LRAS curve. And also balanced budget. This will come into play in some of the later questions. So let's sketch out a graph here quick, the ADAS model for part A. So let's look at part A first. Draw a correctly labeled graph, AD, short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, and show each of the following in the United States. And they want to label the points with these very specific labels here. So let's sketch this out over here. Try and leave myself enough space. All right, so we've got price level over here, and we've got real GDP down here. Let's go like this. So we've got an aggregate demand curve, short run, aggregate supply. And now how do we show below full employment, right? So the LRAS curve is going to be somewhere over here. Label that LRAS. And then they want these points, right? So here's your PL1. So our actual output is going to be here. That's our Y1. And then our full employment output, which would be here on the LRAS curve, right? So point being, you got all the things labeled, and then you want to make sure you have the LRAS curve off to the right somewhere of your intersection here. So that's essentially saying that our output down here is below the full employment output level. All right, so we've got everything on there for our ADAS model there. All right, so part B. The United States government increases spending on goods and services by $100 billion, which is financed by borrowing. How will the increase in government spending affect each of the following? Okay, so we actually don't have to do any calculations here for part B, but we know fiscal spending, right, is meant to move us back towards full employment, right? It's meant to stimulate the aggregate demand curve in the hopes that it will come back towards this full employment level. So based upon that factor alone, we should know that the cyclical unemployment level should decrease, right? If we're doing this government spending, and that number is big enough relative to your economy, that should affect the cyclical unemployment level and reduce it, right? We're increasing employment. What factor does this spending, the fiscal policy, have on the NRU, the natural rate of unemployment? No factor. So remember, the NRU is structural plus frictional, right? Which has nothing to do with the cyclical unemployment. The cyclical unemployment is what makes us move away from the NRU. So we're affecting cyclical unemployment, but the NRU is not affected at all. The structural and frictional, there's nothing that gives us information that those have changed. The NRU is no change, but the cyclical unemployment would decrease there. All right, so let's move on to part C. If the MPC, marginal propensity to consume, is equal to 0.75, calculate the maximum possible change in real gross domestic product that could result from the $100 billion increase in government spending. So this is a spending multiplier question. So if you remember, spending multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus the MPC. In this case, so we have 1 over 1 minus 0.75. So we got 1 over 0.25, which equals 4. So the spending multiplier is 4, and again, they highlight this, the maximum amount. And again, this should jump out at you as a spending multiplier question. So we're going to take 4 times the amount spent. Let's write our answer over here. So 4 times 100 billion is equal to 400 billion. So that's the answer for part C right here. And again, you should probably show your work here as to how you got that answer. All right, so let's go to part D. Using a correctly labeled graph of the loanable funds market, show the effect of the $100 billion increase in government spending on the real interest rate. Okay, so loanable funds market. Let's go, I'm just gonna go down here for some space. So this is a quantity of loanable funds. This is the price, but it's the interest rate, right? I'm going to label it IR up here and call it the real interest rate down there, which is the same thing as the price of money, right? So then we have, just like, so we have a demand and a supply curve. And so how are we showing what's going on in this market? Well, let's say the government, which was running, this is where this part comes in before, right? Balanced budget. And now all of a sudden they're borrowing $100 billion. So that demand for those loanable funds has increased, right? So show a demand shift up. And what you can do, show these 2 points over here. Let's call that R1. Let's call that R2. And you see clearly on this graph how interest rate has increased. Okay, so show the effect of the $100 billion increase of government spending on the real interest rate. So R has increased, and we showed that on the graph. So this illustrates the idea or the phenomenon of crowding out, right? Where the government is stepping in and borrowing funds that would otherwise go to other projects. Okay, so let's jump to part E. Based on the real interest rate change in part D, what is the effect on the long run economic growth rate? Explain. And this is important. So this is one of those sort of work through economic logic type problems. So we have over here, we know real interest rates have increased. So what's going to happen, right? How do we go from there? Well, the biggest thing, and this is sort of a few sentence explanation, but you want to talk about investment or capital formation. So these are going to decrease, right? So investment is interest rate sensitive, right? If interest rates are, I don't know, something low 1%, and I'm running a business, maybe I'm willing to borrow some funds so I can do a project. We can build a factory, whatever it happens to be, to invest for the future, right? And we don't have to pay 1% interest rate to do that. So we may be willing to make that investment and have that capital formation and be able to produce more next year and in future years. Now, if the interest rate is much higher, I don't know, let's say it's 10%. A lot of my projects that I was maybe considering, I'm not going to be able to make any return on that, right? So I'm just essentially not going to make those investments or those capital formations, right? Think about it as factories that are not going to get built, right? Because the interest rate is higher. So you go from that logic, right? And you talk about that in some way. This long run economic growth rate is going to decrease, okay, because investment is going to decrease. Now, how much the interest rate changes is a big factor in here, but it should decrease somewhat as long as your interest rate is increasing. Okay, so let's go to part F now. Now assume that instead of financing the $100 billion increase in government spending by borrowing, the United States government increases taxes by $100 billion. With this equal increase in government spending and taxes, will the real gross domestic product increase, decrease, or remain the same? All right, so I'm going to start with the answer here and then go to the explain part. All right, so it should increase, but it won't increase by as much as we initially talked about in the spending multiplier part of the question. So we've got 100 billion. So we've got spending, and then we've got increases taxes. So we've got a spending multiplier, and then we've got a tax multiplier, right? So spending multiplier we did up above, right? So that effect is going to be multiplied by 4, right? So eventually that's, so let's put times 4, 400 billion increase to the real GDP. Now, what about the tax increase? Okay, so this is a tax multiplier. Now, tax multiplier formula is MPC over negative MPS because they're going to have the opposite effect. So a tax increase is going to serve to reduce real GDP, or a tax decrease is going to increase GDP, right? So it's always sort of the opposite effect, and that's why it's negative in there. So in this case, go back to our original calculation, right? 0.75 was the MPC. So if we're going to calculate the tax multiplier, negative 0.25. So we've got this equal to 3, negative 3. So that net effect, if we multiply that times the 100 billion tax increase, remember it's going to be the opposite direction. So it's going to decrease real GDP by 300 billion. Okay, so compare these numbers now. The initial spending increased by 400 billion, and then the tax increase to sort of balance the budget decreased real GDP by 300 billion. Well, you know, if you add these together, you're still net positive 100 billion there from that effect. So that's how we got to the initial answer there, increase. Now, technically, I don't know, you have to do all of this math. You could have said, I think something simply that it would be positive because the spending multiplier is going to be larger than the tax multiplier effect. So as long as you said that in a way that got through that, you know, the best way to do this is to actually do the math and figure it out. But you know, if you work through the logic and explain that the spending multiplier is going to have a bigger effect than the tax multiplier, then I think you may have been able to get the point here.